Hello, everyone. Here we are today with Dr. Theo Gavrielides, who is very well known in the circles here in human rights and restorative justice. And we're just going to have a few questions for you, Theo. So, first of all, for those that do not know you very well, could you tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and how you got into restorative justice?
How did I get into restorative justice? Okay. Well, background is legal, so I did a long time ago. My law degrees come from family of lawyers. Trained in my dad's law firm, and I think I was doing started my PhD, and it was on victims' rights in the criminal justice system. And I remember writing 100,000 words in just the first year about victims' rights. I was doing that LSE with somebody called Professor Nicola Alessi, and I came across restorative justice because I was in a comparative thesis for Europe. And I went to my supervisor and I said, I think I want to change my topic, my PhD topic, and I want to do something on restorative justice. And I said, well, you want to bin 100,000 words, then you can bin them and we can start again. And that's what I did, and I got into it. I think it was around back in 2000, and ended up doing a PhD in restorative justice, which is called Restorative Justice Theory and Practice, addressing the discrepancy. And as you can figure out from the title, after talking, I think I spoke to probably 500 practitioners from around the world at the time. I realised that restorative justice promises a lot, says a lot, and then what happens in practice and in reality is quite different from the normative promises and aspirations of restorative justice, which are quite honourable and very complementary to the current criminal justice system. But the realities of practice are rather different.
Okay, that's interesting. So that's from your experience turning around. Do you think that the services or the way restorative justice is implemented and delivered does not live up to the expectations created by theory, for example?
Yeah, you could put it that way. I mean, there's no consistency, so you would see variations between countries, between cases and different criminal justice systems. So sometimes practice will surprise you, because let's not forget where restorative justice comes from. So it comes, well, at least what I've been saying in my publications, from community-born and community-led practices. Let's not forget about indigenous practices. In fact, if you read the history,
so that comes for diversity.
Yeah, I mean, we say restorative justice, but we don't all mean the same thing. And, it's not like, this is a table and we all agree that it's a table and it's got 4 legs and a surface. Restorative justice is a very diverse concept. So if you go to Canada and you speak to people from Canada, especially, Aboriginal communities, they'll understand it in a certain way. If you come to Europe and you spoke about, restorative justice in a very kind of legal and top-down structured way, it would mean mediation, it would mean something else, right? So we're not all talking about the same issue, but what I can tell you is that if you look at the history, you can trace it back to, Greek ancient civilizations and, civilizations in Africa, New Zealand, Maori practices. So the practices are very rich sometimes, and they're a lot more complicated than the theoretical understandings of restorative justice. So I wouldn't say that practice is not as good. Some practices are, and maybe theory needs to be written about those practices, but I can tell you that some theoretical arguments are not always backed up with practice.
And also that, for example, you talked about how there is no uniformity in the way practices are applied and delivered. And that could be problem in terms of, obviously, the issue that springs to mind is some people getting a better service than others. So there's no guarantee at the moment that a client or a victim or offender is going to get the best possible service from a practitioner, because best practice is not consensuated and is not shared widely.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be careful when we say that. And I mean, coming again, from a legal background where you function within a very structured criminal justice system, and you also have responsibility when you offer an option to be responsible for that option, whether it's for the victim or the offender. But when it comes to restorative justice, you need to be very careful how you offer it. Now, as I said, it is a community-born, community-led practice. So if you try to standardize it too much, it would take its heart away. Okay? You will remove the very essence of what it is. Okay. Mm-hmm. So let's be very careful when we're trying to define it, when we're trying to regulate it, when we're trying to control it. I mean, it's like controlling love and trying to define love. From one person to the other, it will be different. The question is, what is love? What is the essence of it, and what are you getting out of it? Mm-hmm. So, one practice might even say that it's restorative justice, and in the end, it isn't. Okay. Mm-hmm. It all goes down to what are the basic principles that will characterize something. And we're talking about love. What is that thing that will call it love? What is that thing that will give you the essence of it being love? Mm-hmm. You can write it down in the list of principles. You can write it down in terms of, evaluation and all this sort of things. So at the end of the day, is it what it's supposed to be? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then, what would you say about this trend, which is, on the other hand, quite normal, of trying to regulate practice, restorative justice practice? I mean, you have initiatives from the Restorative Justice Council, for example, but also from other organizations where they're trying to standardize restorative justice practices in a way to guarantee quality and to ensure that people are getting the best possible service in every occasion. So do you think that trying to standardize in effect turn restorative justice into a profession would detract from the nature of restorative justice, from the essence of it?
Yeah, I need to be careful how to answer that, because I mean, on the one hand, I am not a practitioner. I'm not going to lose my job. If I say what I say about standardization and professionalization of restorative justice, so I'm quite free in that respect. And my role is, I'm a researcher, so I sit in the middle. And sometimes I say, things that people who work in the restorative justice field like, and sometimes they don't like it. But I try to stick to evidence. So I don't want to say anything that will affect people who have a job or people who want to get a job. But what I would say in terms of evidence, and there's a lot of, especially a few articles and books on this. If you Google standardization of restorative justice or professionalization of restorative justice, there's a few good articles.
We need to do that.
Yeah, and there are, the views are out there. I publish my own views. If you Google the McDonaldization of restorative justice, you'll get a blog and a couple of articles there. So the evidence is there in terms of what direction we should take. I would say that each country has its own requirements and its own context, whether that's a social context, a legal context, so on and so forth. So if we are, in the UK is a classic example of restorative justice was developed from communities by individual practitioners. And we're now, over the last 5 years, going down a very kind of top-down and structured way of providing restorative justice. Whether that is a good thing or not is not for me to answer. What I would say is that it doesn't have to be an either-or. So as you develop a more controlled top-down way through the criminal justice system offering it, let's not forget the historical provision of restorative justice and continue supporting those individually, locally based, community-based organizations or individuals. And sometimes they don't even have an organization, just do it on
just civic movements.
Yeah, like the civil society, called civil society, right? So when you impose your restrictions because you're providing for the criminal justice system or top-down or a funded kind of approach, which is absolutely acceptable in a specific context, then let's not forget the historical provision of restorative justice. I'm going to give you one quote from John Braithwaite, who was debating about this back in 2001 when he published an article in the British Journal of Criminology, which is called Standards for Restorative Justice. He said, we need to be very careful when we impose standards for restorative justice. Try and say that, a practitioner needs to be on a register. Try and say that to an elder in Australia. Put that in the context of Australian provisions or New Zealand provisions of restorative justice, of elders that have been doing this and doing circles. Same goes in Canada for centuries and ask them to go into a register. Contextually, it doesn't make any sense. Socially, it doesn't make any sense. Now, whether that makes sense in Europe or whether it makes any sense to the UK, that's a different question. But I'm not a UK-based researcher. I'm an international researcher, so I have to put it in the context of, of restorative justice in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And people who write about standards, they will put it in a specific country context.
Okay. You do travel a lot, and you have mentioned that, you are now an international institute with all that means. In terms of the UK, for example, what do you see, what have you seen in other places that you think we're not doing well here in the UK or could do better? And what things have you seen here in the UK that you think that could be applied to other places because it constitutes, in a way, good practice or best practice?
Better in terms of what? In terms of
RJ services, the provision of RJ services.
You mean like doing specific practices on the ground and dealing with different cases, or
different cases,
policy, research,
all of those things.
All of those things. Oh my god. Okay. Well, I don't know. I don't know what is good and what is bad. Again, I tend not to, go down that road.
You don't want to be
being a researcher and academic. You have to be neutral and, not name and shame. But I'll tell you this, in terms of, having been in different sectors in this country, there needs to be a lot more learning on how we can work better together and less, more constructive competition as opposed to destructive competition. Mm-hmm. And the sector, because it's not that big, and the people who work in that sector are not so many, mm-hmm. A lot more gelling and a lot more understanding and dialogue, mm-hmm. I think needs to happen. And I say this with bittersweet, I think, tone. Though restorative justice and mediators and facilitators are all about dialogue, I would say it's the sector that speaks not so much to each other the most. Mm-hmm. I've seen other sectors, because I was in the BME sector before, there's a lot more talking, there's a lot of shouting and a lot of arguing, but mm-hmm. that's part of their dialogue, that's part of their process. So I would love to see a lot more dialogue and a lot more talking and a lot more shouting if we need to, between practitioners, between mediators. But also there needs to be a lot more bridges between practitioners, researchers, mm-hmm. and policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
The three need to work better together.
Like the Restorative Forum, which is a melting pot, a place for all to meet.
Big advert for you now.
There you go. You have to take the chance when it comes. Yeah. What I was thinking is that same complaint, if you like, was made by John Collins on a recent blog on the Restorative Justice Council's website. It's also on the Restorative Forum, by the way. And I have heard it from many people that I have talked to. There is very little cooperation. Everyone seems to be very acutely aware of that. Mm-hmm. There's little cooperation between researchers and practitioners, or the other way around. Mm-hmm. So, for example, mm-hmm. Projects are very close to researchers, mm-hmm. Which means that they cannot gather the evidence that is needed to support, to produce evidence and then to produce evidence-based legislation mm-hmm. or regulation. So everyone knows about it, everyone complains about it. What do you think is stopping people from cooperating more?
Again, from a research point of view, and I did a project on the relationship between researchers and practitioners in the RJ field. If you Google again, one of was the Open University. So we did an open discussion, and we had a working group with researchers and practitioners that came to the university. And
I'll put all the links on
the website, and there is a report that gives specific recommendations. So the concerns come from both sides, and for instance, a practitioner will tell you, I'm dealing with a domestic violence case. Is this very confidential? What reassurances do I get, from the researchers that all confidentiality will be maintained, and so forth and so forth. And people will be very protective of their, their customers.
Do you think mistrust is one of the elements?
Absolutely, yeah, mistrust. And then the researchers, will have their own issues and their own complaints. Practitioners are very busy people. They don't have the time to, but engaging in research is very time consuming, and it's a process, and the complaints come from both sides. I would say, when it comes to research and research ethics, you need to stick to, what we know. You need to have a peer review process. You need to have your confidentiality and everything set up, and have a name that you're going to do the job properly as well, and stick to that. Because sometimes you don't want to, when you're desperate to have a sample, you can't dilute any of your methodology. You have to have an absolute robust methodology, and that's where the funder also comes in as, with responsibility. They can't just be giving funding to do action research and restorative justice with complex cases when there is no understanding of the protection that all those people who are going to be involved, whether they're called victims or offenders or whatever, are being protected while they're being engaged in the research. Is the research organisation, known for its research ethics processes? Do they have a research ethics board? Do they get approval from that board? What is the process of getting approval? Are they having insurance to protect if anything goes wrong? So all those things that funders do need to ask before they fund a research project. They also have responsibility, but the researcher also has responsibility. That will make practitioners feel a lot more comfortable, and they will open the door more. But let's not forget something else, though. By definition, restorative justice happens behind closed doors. Okay, so that needs to be respected. If the victim and the offender don't want that, I don't like using victims and offenders labels.
What do you use?
Well, if we are going to move away, not move away, but if we are going to honour and respect restorative justice ethos, which doesn't look people through labels, and victims and offenders is a label that was constructed for the criminal justice system.
Specifically, yes.
So if we are going to move away from that, let's just call partisan and conflict, or whatever Hauser invented 30 years ago, but definitely not the labels of the criminal justice system. So, and sometimes who is a victim and who is an offender, but that's a different conversation. So if the practitioners are going to feel comfortable that all those safeguards are in place, and the same goes for those who are involved in conflict. And when you do close the door, if they want to have that door closed without any researcher present, then that should be the case. If the researcher is allowed and has convinced that the parameters and the safeguards will be in place, then let's do that, and let's learn more about restorative justice, because there are good practices. I can tell you when restorative justice happens well, it happens really well. So I've seen it, I've been in rooms myself, I've been looking at it, but sometimes it doesn't go that well. So when we do write about it, let's write about it with confidence and with responsibility. Let's not just shout about it and wave the flag without having the evidence. And it's also not a consistent practice. So when we talk about complex cases such as domestic violence and hate crime is one thing. Shoplifting and taking a Mars bar away from a shop is another. Okay, so let's talk about the specificities of it.
But the interesting thing now that you were saying is that you have been to conferences yourself as a witness. Well, not as a witness, but you have been present, but not delivering conferences yourself. Right?
When you say conferences, academic conferences?
No, I mean RJ conferences.
So, there is this tendency in the UK. That's why, again, because I don't come, from a kind of only UK research background. Restorative justice practices could be mediation, direct and indirect, conference in circles. I've been in a lot of circles, especially in Canada, panels. So
but I suppose that our circles are perhaps because of their very nature, where you have a number of people in there, are more accessible. But specifically RJ conference, where you have two parties, using your expression, that's very difficult to get into. It's very difficult to arrange for a person to go and be present when something like that. I understand that that can interfere with the process. Hopefully not, but another person there in that room can be a distraction and could potentially interfere with the process. But at the same time, you need to have researchers, for example, have access to these events. I have an example with Professor Chris Berbeck from Salford University. He was saying that I want to analyze more turning points, the turning points where people go from feeling in one way to feeling another, which actually happened during an RJ conference. But there's no way of getting access to that. There's no way of getting access to this sort of thing. So yes, that needs to be with the consent of both parties. but perhaps practitioners could mediate a bit more in that, try to argue the case that we need to have researchers have access to those events, as well as projects, because in a conversation with another researcher, Ian Marder, who is also a member, he was saying, like, we don't have access to projects, so you cannot assess the status of the situation before the project. You cannot assess the project, and you cannot assess the outcomes because you haven't had access to the project. So how do you generate evidence?
Yeah, again, I mean, I've written about evaluation of different RJ practices and services. There's so much about it. So when it comes to evaluation, one thing that I keep saying is that let's just not focus on, again, indicators that are understood and imposed with a criminal justice mindset. So reduction of reoffending and things like that. I mean, it is a valid thing to check, but there's other things to look at. And for restorative justice, I said, let's not forget about outcomes. Let's not forget about asking not only, they're going to reduce reoffending, but what actually happened. So it's the process, not always, what we understand as indicators within the criminal justice frame of mind. So now to understand that, and it's part of a process, okay, you need to become part of the journey as well. And the journey doesn't finish and end in a mediation room. It's a lot of preparation that happens before. As many practitioners know, then there's the mediation, the agreements, and then there's what happens after. So being part of that journey is absolutely important for the evaluator and the researcher to understand and commit to it, okay? Which again is a funder's responsibility. When you're funding a restorative justice practice, make sure that you have an inbuilt evaluation mechanism and that you support the practitioner both in terms of their knowledge and their time to have that genuine evaluation of the journey, not just of the one session or the two sessions that might take place. Now, I'm learning all the time, and I remember going to Chile 2 years ago, where they asked me to take good models from the UK to train their practitioners on restorative justice. And I was going up and down the country with another colleague of mine who is a practitioner, and we thought we were going to go there and teach them. And we came back knowing more than what we thought we were going to go and teach them. So we took back a number of things that they were doing while they were considering themselves to be in the infantry of like babies of restorative justice, and they thought that the UK was like an elephant. And one thing that I did learn was when I met this Center for Mediation at the University of Chile, was how they were evaluating mediation cases. So these are cases that one-to-one, like offender and victims and the mediator. And they didn't have the researcher in the room because they felt that it would be changing the dynamics. But what they did do, they created a special room in the center of the mediation center where it was allowed for the practitioner to see through a glass without being present, and also be filming the case, obviously with consent and everything, without changing the dynamics. So they would know, they'll probably be observed if that was a choice, or if they didn't want to be observed through a glass, then they'll be filmed. Okay, so it was an option. And I was like, who has the resources and the infrastructure to do that? But they did, and they were babies of restorative justice. They weren't elephants. So sometimes the elephants don't think, well, before you actually do a case, do you have the right infrastructure to do it? Before. And this is just one example, which is what prompted me to say, okay, so if you can actually be present in the room without being present in the room, can you actually watch from a psychology point of view? Because one of the things that I was kind of passionate about is look at restorative justice not from just kind of a social, airy-fairy perspective, but a more scientific perspective. So can you observe people like doing
something
this?
To do with psychology of restorative justice.
Yeah, and actually the University of Chile wrote a chapter in that book, so you can look at their own evidence, which is mainly about mediation, through an evidence-based chapter in that book. So I thought, when people scratch their head or their nose or they do this or they get like this, and from a psychologist's point of view, and a psychologist observes that, what does it mean? When you change the dynamics in the room, how can restorative justice be supported through psychology? And that was when I visited Chile, and they had a couple of experts, psychologists, and they were working with them when the mediator would go in the room. So we started talking about that and how you bring those two together. And one thing led to the other, and I thought, look, there's a lot to be done in terms of bringing different disciplines together. So psychology is one discipline, but I thought, with that book, for instance, which was a challenge for me because I get bored quite easily. So I thought, what sort of challenge am I going to get now? And I thought, well, I need to bring different disciplines together. So that book is not just psychology. I call it the psychology of restorative justice for a reason I'll tell you in a minute. But in fact, what you have is neuroscience. So there's a guy called Don Neisel, who's a neuroscientist.
He's on YouTube. He is on TED.
Yes, he has a.
I'll put a link on this interview to his.
Very good video, and again, that was an experiment that he was doing with restorative justice and neuroscience. So there's a neuroscience in there. There's psychology, there is social sciences, there's legal perspectives, human rights perspectives, different disciplines. So it's not just psychology. So what it does is trying to start a debate where restorative justice is looked at as a topic and as an issue from different disciplines, not just one discipline, not just social sciences. So applied sciences is another one. Not just to understand it, but also to push it a little bit further. So just taking psychology again, if you are going to use the tools of psychology, and there is also the so-called positive psychology, looking at people's talents and supporting those talents as opposed to be looking at them as risks and managing their risks. So if you look at it from a positive psychology point of view, how can we develop restorative justice better? How can we look at things that are not working that well? And how can all these disciplines come together, not just in isolation, but as a unified concept to support this thing that we call restorative justice.
That's very interesting because, other questions that I had here for you were examples to follow. You have already talked about University of Chile, and you're talking about having different disciplines, scientific disciplines, working or being applied to restorative justice to try to advance the research and the science in there. So, what examples do you have? What do you think that needs to be done at the moment? Let's make it specific to the UK because I know you have experience from all over the world. Let's say for the UK, and then if you want from a different country that you have good knowledge of. And also, we mentioned this before when we were in conversation, what not to do. I think that learning from mistakes is very valuable. And a lot of people don't like that. They don't like to admit to have done something wrong for very obvious reasons. But also, a mistake, something that goes wrong, can be a very good learning opportunity. So have you come across any of those as well, whether personal or in the context of a project?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not about me naming and shaming. People get funding to do work, and I don't want to be the person who's going to be responsible for their salary tomorrow. But what I would say, I mean, human nature doesn't like to admit, that we do things wrongly, but we do things wrongly, whether with intentions or not. So I would say, when it comes to at least restorative justice, is there's a paradox. So the more complex the case is, from my experience, having done this for a number of years, the more successful restorative justice